I married the alpha my brother hated. Then he learned the truth. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's emotional story, we have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy heartfelt BL stories filled with unforgettable characters, meaningful relationships, and emotional journeys, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our future videos. It only takes a moment. It is completely free, and your support helps us continue bringing you more touching and dramatic stories like this one. We sincerely appreciate every one of you for being here with us. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We always enjoy seeing how far our stories travel and meeting viewers from across the globe. Now let us begin today's story. Sometimes the person everyone fears is the one who has been protecting them all along. My name is Elias Sterling, and if someone had told me 1 year earlier that I would willingly marry the alpha my own brother despised more than anyone else, I would have laughed and walked away. My older brother, Caleb, had spent years warning me about Lucian Ashford. According to every story I had ever heard, Lucian was cold, calculating, and responsible for a tragedy that permanently divided our two families. Newspapers described him as one of the most powerful alphas in the country, the quiet leader of the Ashford Foundation, and the heir to an extraordinary legacy that stretched back generations. Publicly, he was respected. Privately, many people whispered that no amount of charity could erase the damage he had caused. Caleb believed every one of those stories, and because I trusted my brother more than anyone, I believed them too. Then everything changed when our family's financial foundation unexpectedly began to collapse after several long-term community projects lost critical funding. My parents tried to remain optimistic, but I could see the worry growing heavier every week. Caleb worked tirelessly to keep everything together, refusing every offer of outside assistance because he insisted we would solve our problems alone. That was when Lucian Ashford quietly appeared once again, not through lawyers or business negotiations, but through a simple handwritten letter requesting a private meeting. Caleb refused immediately, tearing the unopened invitation into pieces before anyone else could even read it. I remember watching those torn pages fall into the fireplace, wondering why someone who supposedly hated us would bother reaching out with such unexpected courtesy. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this time addressed personally to me. Inside was only one sentence. I believe your family deserves the truth, even if they choose never to forgive me. There were no threats, no business proposals, and no conditions. Only an invitation to visit Ashford Estate whenever I felt ready. I kept the letter hidden inside my desk for nearly a week before curiosity finally became stronger than fear. Without telling Caleb, I drove to the Ashford Estate early one quiet Saturday morning. Instead of finding an intimidating fortress, I discovered beautifully restored gardens filled with volunteers preparing fresh produce for local food banks. Elderly neighbors laughed with college students while children helped arrange baskets of vegetables that would later be delivered throughout nearby communities. No reporters followed them. No photographers documented the work. Everyone simply helped because they wanted to. An elderly caretaker welcomed me warmly before guiding me toward a peaceful stone courtyard shaded by enormous maple trees. There, Lucian Ashford stood alone beside a small fountain, feeding birds that gathered comfortably around him without fear. He turned as I approached, offering a calm smile that immediately felt different from every rumor I had ever believed. There was no arrogance in his posture and no anger in his eyes. Instead, he looked like someone carrying an invisible weight he had accepted long ago without complaint. Before I could introduce myself, Lucian spoke with quiet sincerity. Thank you for coming, Elias. I know this was not an easy decision. I folded my arms, determined not to be persuaded by appearances alone. If you asked me here to explain yourself, you are wasting your time. He nodded slowly, almost as though he had expected exactly that response. I did not invite you here to defend myself, he answered gently. Some truths only matter when the other person is ready to discover them. He glanced toward the old stone pathway leading deeper into the estate before looking back at me with remarkable calm. One day, I hope your brother will understand why I accepted everyone's hatred without ever asking for their forgiveness. As Lucian's final words settled into the quiet courtyard, I found myself unable to respond. Everything about the man standing before me contradicted the image I had carried for years. I had expected someone eager to justify his past or argue against the accusations surrounding his name. Instead, he seemed almost completely at peace with being misunderstood. It was not resignation. It was the calm acceptance of someone who believed that the truth could survive without constant defense. Lucien invited me to walk with him through the estate, making it clear that I was free to leave whenever I wished. Curiosity overcame caution once again, and I followed him along stone pathways winding through gardens that looked less like the property of an influential family and more like a welcoming public park. Volunteers greeted Lucien warmly as they prepared meals for a weekend community gathering. He thanked every person by name, asking about their families, their children, and even remembering small details from conversations that had taken place months earlier. No one treated him with fear. They treated him with genuine affection and respect. It was impossible not to notice. We eventually arrived at a beautifully restored greenhouse filled with native plants and young trees waiting to be donated to schools throughout the county. Lucien carefully examined a small oak sapling before handing it to a little boy helping the volunteers. "Take good care of it," he said with a gentle smile. "Strong roots are built long before anyone notices the branches." The child nodded proudly before running back to his parents. Watching the interaction stirred an uncomfortable feeling inside me because it challenged everything I thought I knew. Finally, I asked the question that had been following me since I arrived. "If everyone here respects you so much, why does my brother believe you destroyed our family?" Lucien remained silent for several steps before answering. Because from his perspective, that is exactly what happened. His response caught me completely off guard. There was no attempt to shift blame or argue against Caleb's feelings. He simply acknowledged them with remarkable compassion. "Do you believe he is wrong?" I asked. Lucien looked toward the distant hills beyond the estate before replying. "I believe pain often hides important details. When people lose someone or something precious, they naturally search for someone to hold responsible. Sometimes the person standing closest to the truth becomes the easiest person to blame." Before I could ask another question, an elderly gentleman approached us carrying a wooden walking cane. Lucien immediately stepped forward to help him down a short flight of stone steps. The older man smiled warmly. "Thank you, guardian." The title caught my attention immediately. After the gentleman continued on his way, I looked back at Lucien. Why did he call you guardian? For the first time that morning, a thoughtful hesitation crossed his face. "Because my family has carried certain responsibilities for generations," he answered carefully. "Responsibilities that are often easier to fulfill when nobody knows they exist." He did not elaborate, and surprisingly, I did not press him. Instead, we continued walking until we reached a quiet overlook where both the Ashford estate and, in the far distance, part of the Sterling property could be seen beneath the afternoon sunlight. Lucien rested one hand against the old stone railing and spoke so quietly I almost missed his words. "Your brother believes I became his enemy the day our families drifted apart. The truth is that I made a promise long before either of us were old enough to understand its cost." He turned toward me with the same calm expression he had worn since I arrived. "That promise is the reason I accepted his hatred without ever asking him to forgive me. And it is also the reason I agreed to marry you when the opportunity finally came. Because sometimes protecting a family means allowing them to believe the worst about the person standing between them and a much greater danger." After returning home from the Ashford estate, I could not stop replaying every conversation in my mind. The stories Caleb had shared throughout the years painted Lucien as a ruthless alpha who had destroyed everything our family valued. Yet the man I had just met carried himself with remarkable humility. More unsettling than his kindness was the fact that he had never once tried to convince me he was innocent. He simply accepted every misunderstanding as though protecting something more important than his own reputation. For the next several days, I found myself noticing details I had ignored before. Old newspaper articles repeated the same accusations, but rarely offered evidence. Community newsletters, however, quietly praised the Ashford Foundation for restoring libraries, funding schools, and supporting local families after natural disasters. None of those articles mentioned Lucien by name, yet every project traced back to the organization he led. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. Instead of confronting Caleb immediately, I decided to search for answers on my own. I visited several community centers that had received Ashford Foundation grants, pretending I was researching restoration projects for future work. Everywhere I went, people spoke about the foundation with gratitude. Teachers described classrooms that had remained open because emergency funding arrived when no one else responded. Elderly residents remembered historical buildings saved from demolition through anonymous donations. Small business owners explained how neighborhood revitalization projects had given young families reasons to stay instead of leaving town. Whenever I casually mentioned Lucien Ashford's name, people smiled with quiet respect rather than suspicion. One afternoon, I met an elderly librarian organizing donated books inside a beautifully restored reading room. She recognized my last name almost immediately. "You are a Sterling," she said warmly. I nodded, expecting the conversation to become uncomfortable. Instead, she looked thoughtfully toward the tall windows overlooking a small memorial garden. "Your family has done wonderful things for this county," she said. "So has the Ashford family." It always saddened me that people believed those two names could no longer stand together. I asked what she meant, but before answering, she unlocked an old display case containing photographs from community events held decades earlier. One faded picture immediately caught my attention. Standing side by side were members of both the Sterling and Ashford families, smiling together beneath the same crest displayed above the entrance of the building. There was no sign of rivalry, only partnership. "This was taken before everything changed," the librarian explained gently. "People often remember the ending of a story but forget how it truly began." I studied the photograph carefully and noticed something else. Beside the adults stood a young boy wearing the same distinctive oak-shaped pendant I had seen around Lucien's neck during my visit to the estate. Curious, I asked about it. The librarian smiled knowingly. "That symbol belongs to the old guardian line," she replied. "Very few people still recognize it." Before I could ask another question, she quietly added, "Those who carried that symbol were expected to protect others before protecting themselves." Her words echoed almost perfectly what Lucien had hinted at days earlier. Driving home that evening, I realized every answer I uncovered only created another question. If Lucien truly belonged to a tradition built upon service and sacrifice, why had Caleb become so certain he was our family's enemy? More importantly, what had happened between our families that transformed decades of trust into years of resentment? As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Caleb standing on the front porch holding an envelope sealed with the unmistakable Ashford crest. His expression was colder than I had ever seen before, and without saying a single word, he held the unopened letter toward me as though the past itself had finally decided it was time to speak. Caleb stood silently on the porch with the sealed envelope resting in his hand. The familiar Ashford crest seemed almost out of place against the weathered wood of our family home. I reached for it instinctively, but he did not let go immediately. His eyes remained fixed on mine, carrying years of frustration that had slowly become part of who he was. "He wants to meet," Caleb finally said. One last time. There was no anger in his voice this time, only exhaustion. After a long moment, he released the envelope and walked inside without another word. I carefully broke the wax seal. The letter was handwritten in elegant script, unmistakably Lucien's. There were only a few lines. "Some promises cannot be explained through letters. If the Sterling family truly wishes to understand the past, I will open the Hall of Vows. It has remained closed to outsiders for generations, but the truth belongs to everyone who has carried its burden. You may come together, or not at all." I read the letter twice before quietly placing it on the kitchen table. Caleb returned several minutes later carrying an old wooden box I had not seen since childhood. He opened it carefully, revealing faded photographs, newspaper clippings, and several letters written by our grandfather. "I promised myself I would never look at these again," he admitted. "But perhaps I should have years ago." We spent the evening reading through every document. Most of them described community projects completed jointly by the Sterling and Ashford families decades earlier. There were photographs of hospitals, schools, public libraries, and memorial gardens built together. In every image, both family crests appeared side by side. Nothing resembled the bitter rivalry I had grown up believing. One photograph immediately captured my attention. It showed our grandfather shaking hands with an elderly alpha wearing the same oak-shaped pendant Lucien carried today. Written beneath the picture were 6 simple words. "Together we guard more than ourselves." Caleb stared at the photograph for a long time before quietly saying, I have never seen this before. The following morning we drove together toward the Ashford estate. The journey felt strangely quiet, neither of us certain what waited beyond the gates. When we arrived, Lucian greeted us personally without security, lawyers, or advisors standing behind him. He simply thanked us for coming before leading us toward the oldest wing of the estate. Hidden beyond thick oak doors stood a magnificent circular chamber unlike anything I had ever seen. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows depicting generations of men and women standing together beneath a great oak tree. Stone walls were covered with engraved names stretching back centuries, each accompanied not by titles or achievements, but by short descriptions of lives devoted to protecting communities during difficult times. At the center of the chamber rested a beautifully carved stone table upon which lay an enormous leather-bound volume. Lucian gently placed one hand upon its cover. "This is the Hall of Vows," he said quietly. "Every guardian has stood here to renew the same promise before accepting responsibility for the next generation." Caleb looked around the chamber with visible confusion. "Why are you showing us this?" Lucian met his gaze without hesitation. "Because your family deserves to know what my family chose to protect, even when doing so cost us friendship, trust, and our own reputation." He slowly opened the ancient volume, revealing handwritten vows preserved across generations. Every page ended with nearly identical words. "The guardian shall carry the burden alone if revealing the truth would endanger those placed in their care." Caleb stepped closer, reading the sentence again in complete silence. Lucian closed the book gently before looking toward both of us with remarkable calm. "Everything your family believes about me began with that single promise. Because sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is allowing yourself to be misunderstood until the people you love are finally safe enough to learn the truth." The silence inside the Hall of Vows seemed to stretch across generations. Caleb remained standing before the ancient volume, reading the final sentence again as though the words themselves might somehow change if he looked long enough. I could see the certainty that had guided him for years, beginning to crack beneath the weight of evidence resting all around us. Lucian did not interrupt. He simply allowed the room to speak for itself. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting gentle colors across the stone floor where hundreds of engraved names formed a quiet reminder that every guardian had accepted responsibility long before they accepted recognition. An elderly gentleman entered the chamber with slow, measured steps. His silver hair and weathered expression suggested decades of service, yet his eyes remained remarkably kind. Lucian greeted him with deep respect. "Thank you for coming, Master Rowan." The older man nodded before turning toward Caleb and me. "I have been waiting many years for this conversation," he said softly. "Not because the truth was hidden forever, but because it could only be shared when it no longer placed innocent people at risk." He carefully unlocked a small wooden cabinet built into the wall beside the Hall of Vows. Inside rested dozens of journals, each protected within handcrafted cases bearing the crest of both the Ashford and Sterling families. Master Rowan removed one journal and placed it gently upon the stone table. "Your grandfather wrote this together with Lucian's grandfather," he explained. Caleb immediately looked up in surprise. "Together?" The old guardian smiled sadly. "They remained trusted friends until the very end." He opened the journal to a page marked decades earlier. Instead of business records or legal agreements, the pages contained handwritten accounts describing a difficult period when both families had quietly protected several community organizations from financial collapse while refusing public recognition. As I continued reading, another entry revealed the beginning of the misunderstanding that had divided everyone. Years earlier, one confidential decision required the Ashford family to publicly accept responsibility for a failure that would otherwise have destroyed several charitable institutions and endangered thousands of families depending upon them. The decision preserved those organizations, but it permanently damaged the Ashford reputation. "Your grandfather begged Lucian's grandfather not to make that sacrifice," Master Rowan explained. "But the guardian oath required the burden to fall upon whoever could carry it without exposing the people they were protecting." Caleb slowly lowered the journal, his hands trembling slightly. "So my grandfather knew?" Master Rowan nodded. "He knew the truth, but he also honored the oath. Before he passed away, He asked future guardians to reveal everything only when the danger had completely disappeared. Caleb looked toward Lucien, disbelief slowly giving way to painful understanding. All these years, you allowed everyone to believe your family betrayed ours. Lucien answered with the same quiet calm that had never left him. It seemed like a small price if it meant the people depending upon those programs could continue living safely. There was no pride in his voice, only simple honesty. Master Rowan then unfolded one final document signed by both grandfathers. At the bottom appeared a sentence written in bold handwriting that immediately captured my attention. When the burden has finally ended, let our families be reunited not through obligation, but through trust freely chosen. I looked from the document to Lucien and suddenly understood why he had never tried to defend himself. Every choice he had made honored a promise much older than either of us. He had protected the oath, preserved both families, and carried years of misunderstanding without resentment because he believed some truths became meaningful only when people were ready to receive them. Standing inside that ancient hall, surrounded by generations who had chosen responsibility over recognition, I realized the man my brother had spent years hating had quietly become the very example of everything our own family had always hoped to be. When we finally stepped out of the Hall of Vows, the afternoon sun felt strangely different, as though the world itself had become lighter after years of carrying a misunderstanding that no longer belonged to anyone. Caleb walked several steps ahead of us without speaking. The confidence that had once fueled every accusation against Lucien had been replaced by quiet reflection. For the first time since I could remember, my brother seemed uncertain, not because he lacked courage, but because the truth demanded something far more difficult than certainty. It demanded humility. Before leaving the estate, Lucien invited us to join him for a simple meal prepared by the community kitchen. There was nothing extravagant about it. Fresh bread, homemade soup, vegetables harvested from the estate gardens, and warm tea were served beneath a large pavilion where volunteers and neighbors shared the same tables regardless of status or family name. No reserved seating existed for the Ashford family. Lucien greeted every guest with the same calm respect, helping an elderly volunteer carry heavy baskets before sitting beside a group of children excitedly describing the trees they had planted earlier that morning. Watching him move naturally among everyone without expecting recognition made the revelations inside the Hall of Vows feel even more believable. This was not someone performing kindness for appearances. This was simply the life he had quietly chosen. Caleb remained unusually silent throughout lunch. Several times I noticed him watching Lucien from across the table, almost as though he were trying to reconcile two completely different people inside his own mind. Eventually, after most of the volunteers returned to their work, Caleb stood and slowly approached Lucien, who was collecting empty dishes alongside the kitchen staff. Without warning, my brother reached for the tray Lucien was carrying and gently took it from his hands. Lucien looked surprised. "Allow me," Caleb said quietly. "You have carried enough by yourself." Those few words held more meaning than any formal apology ever could. Lucien smiled softly, not with triumph or relief, but with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he answered simply. Neither of them spoke about the past again that afternoon. They did not need to. Some wounds begin healing the moment blame finally gives way to understanding. Before we left, Master Rowan invited us into a small archive adjoining the Hall of Vows. Unlike the ceremonial chamber, this room contained detailed records of every community project, completed jointly by the Ashford and Sterling families over more than a century. Photographs, letters, architectural drawings, and handwritten journals filled countless shelves. Together they revealed a remarkable truth. Long before business achievements or public recognition defined either family, both had dedicated themselves to protecting schools, libraries, hospitals, and neighborhoods whenever difficult times threatened the people around them. Their partnership had never been built upon wealth. It had always been built upon service. As we prepared to leave the archive, Master Rowan handed Caleb a carefully wrapped journal bearing our grandfather's signature. He asked that this return to the Sterling family when the burden had finally ended, he explained. Caleb accepted it with both hands, his eyes filled with quiet emotion. During the drive home, neither of us turned on the radio. The silence between us no longer felt heavy. Instead, it felt peaceful, like the calm that follows a storm after the sky is finally cleared. As the evening sun disappeared beyond the hills, Caleb looked out the window and spoke so softly I almost missed his words. For years I believed protecting our family meant holding on to my anger. Today I learned that protecting a family sometimes begins with having the courage to let that anger go. Listening to my brother, I realized the ancient promise preserved inside the Hall of Vows had already begun fulfilling its greatest purpose once again. It was not merely preserving history. It was quietly teaching every new generation that truth has the power to reunite hearts long after fear has divided them. Several weeks passed after our visit to the Hall of Vows, yet its quiet lessons continued shaping every decision our family made. Caleb immersed himself in reading the journal our grandfather had entrusted to him, often spending long evenings turning fragile pages with the same care someone might give a treasured family photograph. Every chapter revealed another forgotten partnership between the Sterling and Ashford families, another example of ordinary people quietly choosing service instead of recognition. The more he learned, the more I noticed a gentle change in him. The anger that had once defined every conversation about Lucien slowly gave way to thoughtful curiosity. One crisp autumn morning, Caleb asked if I would accompany him back to the Ashford estate. There was no hesitation in my answer. When we arrived, the estate was preparing for its annual Community Heritage Festival, an event welcoming local families, teachers, students, artists, and volunteers to celebrate projects completed throughout the year. Children proudly displayed paintings inspired by neighborhood landmarks, while musicians performed beneath colorful banners hanging between the ancient oak trees. Instead of standing on a stage, Lucien moved quietly among the guests, helping volunteers arrange chairs and greeting elderly visitors with genuine warmth. No one would have guessed he was the head of the Ashford family unless they already knew him. Caleb watched silently for several minutes before finally walking toward him. Lucien noticed us immediately and smiled with the same calm kindness he had always shown. "I am glad you both came," he said. Caleb took a slow breath before speaking. "There is something I need to do." For a moment, the sounds of the festival seemed to fade into the background. My brother looked directly at Lucien, his expression completely honest. "For years I believed protecting my family meant refusing to listen to you. I carried resentment that belonged to another generation without ever asking whether it was still true. I cannot change the years I spent judging you, but I can choose not to continue that mistake." Lucien remained quiet before answering with remarkable gentleness. "You were protecting the people you loved. I have never blamed you for that." Caleb slowly shook his head. "Perhaps, but protecting people also means having the courage to admit when we were wrong." Without another word, he extended his hand. Lucien looked at it for only a brief moment before accepting the gesture with quiet gratitude. There were no dramatic speeches, no applause, and no celebration. Just two men choosing understanding instead of pride. Watching them shake hands beneath the old oak tree felt more meaningful than any grand ceremony I had ever witnessed. Later that afternoon, Master Rowan invited several local students into the Hall of Vows for an educational tour explaining the history of community service shared by both families. For the first time in generations, the Ashford and Sterling names appeared together once again, not because anyone wanted to rewrite history, but because the complete truth finally had room to be remembered. As the students explored the ancient chamber, one curious teenager asked why so many guardians had accepted being misunderstood instead of revealing the truth immediately. Master Rowan smiled before looking toward Lucien. "Because some responsibilities require patience," he answered. "Character is measured not by how quickly someone is believed, but by whether they continue doing what is right even when no one understands." Those words lingered with every person in the room. As I watched Lucien speaking with the students afterward, answering every question with kindness instead of authority, I realized the greatest mystery had never been why my brother hated him. The greatest mystery was how someone could carry so much undeserved blame for so many years and still choose compassion every single day. And perhaps that quiet strength was the truest legacy any guardian could ever leave behind. The handshake beneath the ancient oak tree quietly marked the end of one chapter, but it also became the beginning of something none of us had expected. Over the following months, the Ashford and Sterling families slowly began working together once again, not because history demanded it, but because trust had finally returned where suspicion had lived for far too long. Joint restoration projects resumed across neighboring communities. Volunteers from both foundations shared resources, and schools that had once chosen sides now welcomed support from everyone without hesitation. Watching those changes unfold reminded me that healing rarely happens through one dramatic moment. It grows through countless ordinary decisions repeated every single day. My own relationship with Lucien changed just as naturally. We spent long afternoons visiting, libraries awaiting restoration, community gardens preparing for new seasons, and youth centers searching for better ways to encourage young people to preserve local history. Every conversation revealed another quiet layer of the man I had once believed was incapable of warmth. He listened more than he spoke. He always asked volunteers what they needed before offering advice. He remembered birthdays, family milestones, and even the names of children he had met only once months earlier. His kindness never demanded recognition because it had become part of who he was long before anyone noticed. One peaceful evening, after completing a restoration ceremony for a century-old town hall, Lucien invited me to walk through the estate gardens as the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. The familiar oak tree stood peacefully in the distance, its branches stretching wide across the evening sky. We reached the stone bench where so many important conversations had quietly changed our lives. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Lucien smiled softly before breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you remember the first day you came here?" I laughed quietly. I remember believing I was meeting the man everyone warned me about. He lowered his eyes with gentle amusement. And now, I looked around the gardens filled with volunteers preparing flower beds for the coming spring. Now I think I met the only person willing to protect everyone else before protecting himself. Lucien remained silent for a moment before answering. I spent many years believing carrying every burden alone was the only way to honor the guardian oath. He turned toward me, his expression filled not with sadness, but peaceful honesty. "Then you reminded me that even guardians deserve someone willing to walk beside them." His words settled gently between us. I reached for his hand without hesitation, and for the first time since we met, there were no unanswered questions standing between us. No misunderstandings. No ancient promises separating two families. Only two people choosing the same future because they genuinely wanted to share it. Several days later, Master Rowan invited both families back to the Hall of Vows for a quiet ceremony unlike any held before. Instead of renewing an ancient promise in isolation, representatives of both the Ashford and Sterling families gathered together beneath the stained glass windows, honoring generations of guardians. The old journal that had once carried only solemn responsibilities was opened once more. Beneath the final completed page, Master Rowan carefully revealed a new inscription prepared for future generations. It read, "An oath protects the past, but trust builds the future." Lucien looked toward me before gently placing the journal back upon the stone table. "Would you walk this future with me?" he asked softly. I smiled without the slightest hesitation. "I already have." As warm afternoon sunlight filled the Hall of Vows, I realized the greatest truth my brother had finally discovered was not hidden inside ancient journals or forgotten promises. It was standing quietly beside me all along. The Alpha everyone had feared had never been waiting for forgiveness. He had only been waiting for the day when truth would finally give everyone the freedom to choose love instead of judgment. Years passed, yet the lessons born inside the Hall of Vows never faded. Instead, they quietly shaped every decision that followed. The Ashford and Sterling families no longer measured success by influence or reputation alone. Together, they restored historic schools, expanded community libraries, protected local museums, and created scholarships for young people who dreamed of preserving the stories and traditions of future generations. The old rivalry that had once divided neighbors slowly became nothing more than a lesson shared with those willing to listen. Whenever people asked how two families with such a painful history had managed to rebuild their trust, neither Lucien nor Caleb spoke about old misunderstandings first. They spoke about the courage to seek the truth before judging another person. That simple lesson became the foundation of everything that followed. My own life changed in ways I could never have imagined on the day I first stepped through the gates of the Ashford estate. Lucien and I built our home, the Same way we restored every historic building together, patiently, carefully, and with deep respect for every piece that deserved to be preserved. Our mornings often began with coffee beneath the ancient oak tree before walking through the gardens, where volunteers prepared another day of community projects. Our evenings usually ended with quiet conversations about new schools, restoration plans, and the children whose lives had been transformed by opportunities neither of us had enjoyed when we were younger. Every ordinary day reminded me that the strongest relationships are not built through dramatic promises. They are built through thousands of small acts of kindness repeated with unwavering consistency. Caleb visited the estate often, no longer as a reluctant guest, but as a trusted partner. Watching him laugh beside Lucien while discussing new community initiatives would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Sometimes I caught the two of them standing together before the Hall of Vows, reading the journals our grandfathers had protected for so long. They rarely spoke while doing so. They simply honored the people whose sacrifices had quietly guided both families toward reconciliation. One bright spring morning, Master Rowan invited children from nearby schools to plant young oak trees throughout the estate grounds. Each child received a small wooden plaque carrying a single sentence chosen from the guardian journals. They eagerly searched for places to plant their trees, knowing they might never live long enough to see those branches fully grown. Master Rowan smiled as he watched them work. "That has always been the meaning of a legacy," he said softly. "We plant what future generations will one day enjoy." Before retiring from his lifelong responsibilities, Master Rowan placed the Book of Guardians upon the stone table one final time. This time, however, he did not ask Lucien alone to sign the newest page. Instead, he invited representatives from both the Ashford and Sterling families to stand together beneath the stained glass windows. At the bottom of the final page appeared a new inscription written beneath every vow that had come before it. It read, "Truth restores what fear divides, and love protects what truth reveals." Years later, visitors entering the Hall of Vows first notice a bronze sculpture standing beneath the great oak tree outside. It depicts two families walking together while children carry young saplings toward the future. Beneath the sculpture, another inscription quietly welcomes everyone who enters. Never judge a heart before you know its story. Whenever someone asks why those words were chosen, I always smile, because the answer changed my life forever. I once believed the strongest alpha was the one who could command respect through power. I eventually learned that true strength belongs to the one willing to carry misunderstanding with grace, protect others without seeking recognition, forgive even after years of unfair judgment, and continue choosing kindness every single day. That was the truth my brother finally discovered, and it became the greatest legacy any of us could ever inherit.